Hey guys, tonight we begin with architecture, the kind that was designed to outlast wars, plagues, and tenants with terrible hygiene. We're talking about medieval castles, those massive stone monsters that dot the European countryside like ancient threats frozen in time. Before you imagine yourself as a brave knight storming the battlements, remember, statistically, you'd probably be the peasant who spent 40 years hauling stones up a hill for a lord who couldn't pronounce your name. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before castles became romantic ruins for tourists and Netflix dramas, they were Europe's way of saying, we've completely given up on peace. After the Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, civilization didn't just decline. It took a several hundred-year nap. The continent transformed into a chaotic free for all of raids, revenge, and questionable personal hygiene. Viking longships prowled the coasts. Magyar horsemen swept across the plains, and local warlords battled each other over parcels of muddy land. Everyone with a sword wanted territory, and everyone with territory wanted walls, thick ones. The earliest answer to this chaos was the motte-and-bailey, a wooden fort perched on a man-made hill surrounded by a fence. Picture a treehouse built by someone deeply paranoid. These structures were cheap, fast to construct, and about as durable as a breadstick left in the rain. Fire was their greatest enemy, followed closely by wind, rot, and the occasional angry mob with torches. If a rival lord didn't burn your fort down, the weather eventually would. Medieval builders called them temporary. Raiders called them kindling. But here's the quirky part. Some historians believe these wooden forts were deliberately designed to be replaceable. In a world where allegiances shifted constantly, a lord might abandon one hill and build on another within months. Mobility, not permanence, was the strategy. Your castle wasn't your forever home. It was your current defensive position. Eventually, someone had the revolutionary idea that maybe, just maybe, buildings designed to survive attacks shouldn't be flammable. Enter stone, the medieval version of an upgrade patch. Stone didn't burn, didn't rot, and looked intimidating enough to make peasants reconsider asking for better working conditions. But stone came at a price. It was expensive, brutally heavy, and required a small army of masons, engineers, and disposable laborers who probably died before seeing the finished product. Construction could take decades, which was fine because most lords didn't plan to move anyway. And once finished, that stone keep was more than just a fortress. It was the medieval equivalent of posting on social media. I own this valley, and possibly God favors me. The Normans took this to Olympic levels. After invading England in 1066, they built castles everywhere, sometimes to mark territory, sometimes just for the fun of scaring the locals. It's estimated that within a century, over 1,000 stone castles dotted the English landscape alone, all declaring, "Welcome to feudalism, population." You Early stone castles were ugly but effective. No comfort, no plumbing, and windows smaller than your phone screen. They were fortresses first, homes second, and damp caves third. But they worked, because nothing says, "Do not invade," quite like a wall thick enough to outlive your grandchildren. Historians still argue whether the rapid spread of castle building was primarily defensive or symbolic. Were lords genuinely afraid, or were they just engaged in the medieval equivalent of an arms race, competing to out-intimidate their neighbors? The answer is probably both. The wooden fort had been humanity's hopeful shrug. The stone castle was its grim, magnificent middle finger to anyone who dared challenge the established order. And with each stone laid, Europe was carving its future into the landscape, one fortress at a time. Once the first stone castles rose across Europe, medieval lords realized something crucial about real estate. Location wasn't just important, it was everything. And the best location? Somewhere absolutely miserable to reach, preferably on a hill, a steep, windy, ankle-breaking hill that made every approaching enemy question their life choices halfway up. In the Middle Ages, one architectural rule reigned supreme. If you're going to build a castle, put it somewhere annoying. The logic was brilliant in its simplicity. A hill gave you the advantage of visibility, defensibility, and smugness. From up there, you could spot invading armies days before they arrived and spend the extra time deciding whether to fight them or just mock them from a distance. Lords loved that part, the ability to point down at struggling attackers and say, "You can try, but you'll regret it halfway up." Gravity, that ancient and unpaid bodyguard, worked best when it was on your side. Every step an attacker took uphill meant less breath, less energy, and a greater chance of collapsing before even seeing the front gate. Arrows flew farther downhill. Rocks rolled with devastating momentum. Even boiling water, when poured from above, gained velocity and spite. The hill wasn't just a foundation, it was a weapon. But while it made sense strategically, it was pure suffering for everyone else. The builders hauling tons of stone up goat paths cursed the day. Their lord learned about elevation. Supplies had to be dragged uphill by oxen who, by the second trip, were probably reconsidering their entire existence. Even servants hated it. Imagine carrying dinner up 3 terraces, 2 staircases, and a drawbridge, only to be told the Lord wasn't hungry after all. The medieval equivalent of climbing to the 5th floor with groceries and realizing you forgot your keys. Here's the quirky detail. Some castles were built on hills that weren't naturally there. Lords actually ordered thousands of workers to pile dirt and rocks into artificial mounds, essentially building mountains just to put fortresses on top. The effort was staggering, but the payoff was psychological. A man-made hill announced not just power, but the ability to reshape the earth itself. The aesthetic payoff, though, was undeniable. From below, the castle looked divine, majestic, unreachable, a literal monument to superiority. From above, it was damp, drafty, and perpetually covered in fog. The view was spectacular, assuming you could see past the cloud sitting on your roof. Not every castle was on a perfect hill, of course. Some were built on cliffs because gravity was apparently too subtle a threat. others perched on river bends or rocky ridges that were more dangerous to the occupants than to any enemy. Still, the principle remained. Higher was better. Historians still argue whether the obsession with height was primarily practical or symbolic. Did lords choose hills because they genuinely improved defense, or because towering over the landscape satisfied an ego that couldn't be contained within human-sized architecture? Medieval records suggest both motivations existed simultaneously. A castle on a hill defended you from invaders and reminded every peasant, every passing merchant, and every rival lord that power quite literally lived above them. Then came the moat, Europe's most ambitious puddle, the ultimate accessory for lords who wanted both safety and bragging rights. In theory, it was brilliant. A wide, water-filled trench made it nearly impossible for invaders to reach your walls. Siege towers couldn't cross it, ladders slipped in it, and soldiers sank in it wearing full armor. It was essentially medieval anti-personnel landscaping. In practice, though, most moats were just deep, filthy trenches filled with stagnant water, dead fish, and whatever the locals accidentally dumped in there. They smelled like divine punishment and looked worse. But if you were an attacker, that smell alone might make you reconsider your career path. Not all moats were watery either. Some were dry, filled with wooden spikes, sharp rocks, or other creative deterrents. A dry moat was cheaper, easier to maintain, and far more likely to break your legs. Medieval engineers loved the idea of enemies falling into ditches so much they sometimes built two. Why stop at one bad idea when you can double down? The real genius of the moat wasn't physical, it was psychological. It told would-be invaders, "You're not even close to my walls yet, and you're already losing." The hill and the moat worked together like a 1-2 punch of geographic cruelty, ensuring that anyone who approached your castle arrived exhausted, demoralized, and possibly drowning. In the medieval world, the gatehouse was the architectural equivalent of a fake smile, polite on the outside, murderous on the inside. It looked like an entrance, but it was really a trap disguised as courtesy. Every castle had one, and from a distance, it seemed almost welcoming. Tall towers, banners flying, drawbridge down, sunlight glinting on stone. You'd think, what a welcoming sight. 5 minutes later, you'd be lying beneath it, full of arrows and regret. The gatehouse was a masterpiece of defensive psychology. It combined deception, geometry, and gravity in ways only a paranoid medieval architect could appreciate. The moment an invading force crossed the drawbridge and entered the tunnel, the trap closed. Portcullises, those spiked iron gates, dropped like guillotines, sealing both ends. Gates slammed shut behind you, and suddenly, congratulations, you were in a stone hallway designed exclusively to kill you. Above you hung murder holes, those charmingly named openings through which defenders could drop rocks, boiling oil, or, on budget days, just anything heavy they had lying around. Boiling water was more common than oil, actually, because oil was expensive and medieval lords weren't about to waste good cooking supplies on invaders. But the psychological effect was the same. You looked up, saw the holes, and realized you'd walked into a death corridor with no way out. On both sides of you, Arrow slits allowed crossbowmen to turn that confined space into a medieval blender. The gatehouse wasn't an entryway, it was an automated shredder powered by human screams. Defenders loved it. Attackers hated it. Even couriers delivering messages probably developed trust issues from passing through there regularly. Here's the quirky part. Despite all this brilliance, castle designers couldn't resist overcomplicating things. Some gatehouses had multiple portcullises, just in case the first one wasn't traumatizing enough. Others featured drawbridges over secondary moats, forcing attackers to juggle ladders, siege towers, and their rapidly diminishing self-esteem simultaneously. One English castle, Harlech, had a gatehouse so elaborate it contained 7 different defensive obstacles before you even reached the courtyard. 7. That's not defense. That's showing off. But the best part? The gatehouse doubled as living quarters for the guards. Yes, the same place where boiling oil occasionally rained from the ceiling was also someone's office. Imagine trying to sleep knowing that at any moment your ceiling hatch might open and a flaming boulder might roll through. The guards stationed there lived in constant readiness, which probably meant constant anxiety, surrounded by the tools of their trade, crossbows, murder implements, and a disturbing amount of hot oil. Historians still argue whether gatehouses were primarily functional or psychological weapons. Some believe their complexity was necessary to counter increasingly sophisticated siege tactics. Others argue they were deliberately over-designed to intimidate attackers before battle even began. A way of saying, look how much thought we put into killing you. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Gatehouses worked, and they terrified people, which made them work even better. The drawbridge itself deserves mention. When raised, it became part of the wall, a massive wooden barrier reinforced with iron. When lowered, it was an invitation, but one that could be revoked instantly. Chains and counterweights controlled its movement, operated from within the gatehouse by soldiers who held, quite literally, the keys to the kingdom. Crossing that bridge meant you were being watched, evaluated, and possibly set up for disappointment. No feature defined the genius of castle design quite like the gatehouse. It was both architecture and theater, a stage where overconfident invaders learned humility and defenders got front row seats to the carnage. The drawbridge may have said, "Welcome," but the gatehouse always followed up with, "Just kidding." It was the medieval version of customer service, polite until you tried to enter without permission. Even in peacetime, the gatehouse served its purpose. It controlled access, displayed wealth and craftsmanship, and reminded every visitor, whether noble guest or nervous merchant, that they entered at the Lord's pleasure. That tunnel, with its ominous shadows and echoing footsteps, was a threshold between the outside world and the Lord's domain, and in crossing it, you acknowledged, consciously or not, that you were stepping into someone else's power. The gatehouse wasn't just a door. It was a statement, a warning, and a promise all carved into stone. It said, "We have thought of everything. We have prepared for your arrival. And if you come with ill intent, this tunnel will be the last thing you see." That message, delivered through architecture alone, was perhaps the gatehouse's greatest achievement, turning stone and iron into a language every enemy understood. Nothing in a medieval castle was built by accident. especially the stairs. Those narrow, twisting, ankle-breaking nightmares weren't bad design. They were genius cruelty carved into stone. Most castle staircases spiraled clockwise going up, and to the average medieval visitor, that just meant inconvenience. To a defender, it meant physics with a vendetta. Since most soldiers were right-handed, attackers climbing upward found their sword arms pinned against the central column, unable to swing freely. Meanwhile, defenders above could strike downward with full range of motion. It was the architectural equivalent of fighting someone in a hallway shaped like a corkscrew. You were doomed before you started. These weren't comfortable, broad stairs either. Each step was deliberately uneven in height and depth, perfect for tripping anyone foolish enough to run. In peacetime, servants carrying food cursed them. In wartime, soldiers died on them. Either way, the builder got his money's worth. And just to add insult to injury, staircases almost always narrowed as they rose. That made it impossible for more than one attacker to climb at a time. Essentially a medieval version of take a number. If you were lucky enough to make it to the top, you arrived exhausted, dizzy, and already halfway through your life expectancy. Some castles even reverse the spiral direction in different towers just to confuse invaders. Imagine breaching a fortress after days of siege, sprinting up a staircase, and realizing halfway through that your sword no longer fits the geometry. That's not just defense. That's psychological warfare with steps. Here's the quirky detail. Not all spiral staircases went clockwise. A handful of castles, particularly in Scotland, featured counterclockwise spirals. Why? Historians believe certain left-handed lords or clans deliberately reversed them to give their own defenders the advantage. The Kerr family of Ferniehirst Castle, known for producing left-handed swordsmen, allegedly built their stairs backward as a family signature. Whether true or legend, it shows how deeply personal and strategic these architectural choices could be. If you've ever toured a castle and wondered why the windows are so tiny, congratulations, you've just spotted the medieval version of a machine gun nest. Those narrow gaps weren't for sunlight or fresh air. They were arrow slits, and they turned archery into an art form of casual homicide. On the outside, they looked like paper-thin cracks, barely wide enough for a dagger. But step inside, and you'd see the brilliance. The slits widened dramatically on the interior, giving archers plenty of room to aim while keeping themselves nearly invisible to the enemy. Attackers could shoot thousands of arrows toward the wall, and 99% would just ping harmlessly off the stone. Meanwhile, the defender inside, dry, smug, and slightly underpaid, could calmly return fire with pinpoint precision. It was medieval efficiency at its finest. One man, one slit, dozens of new ventilation holes in the enemy ranks, and they weren't all simple vertical cuts either. As siege warfare evolved, so did the slits. Cross-shaped openings accommodated crossbows, circular holes suited early firearms, and angled designs covered specific approach routes. The medieval architect wasn't just building walls, he was designing an interactive experience of despair. Of course, all this came with side effects. Castles were dark and cold because sunlight was basically outlawed in favor of defense. Inside, you'd bump into walls, furniture, or other people long before you saw them. And when the enemy wasn't attacking, those same arrow slits were just excellent ways to let in rain, snow, and bone-chilling drafts. Still, they worked. A handful of archers could hold off entire armies, protected by geometry and good craftsmanship. Historians still argue whether arrow slits were primarily defensive innovations or evolved through trial and error. Some evidence suggests castle builders copied designs from Crusader fortifications in the Holy Land, where Muslim architects had perfected similar techniques centuries earlier. Others believe the designs emerged independently across Europe as siege technology advanced. Either way, the result was the same: walls that could see and kill without being seen or killed in return. Some castles even used fake arrow slits, just carved into the walls, to make the fortress look deadlier than it actually was. Nothing says confidence like pretending to have more firepower than you do. Arrow slits were simple, silent, and soul-crushingly effective. From the outside, they whispered, "We see you." From the inside, they muttered, "Try your luck." And from a safe distance, everyone else said, "You know what? Maybe we'll siege somewhere else." If the castle were a body, the keep was its heart, cold, overbuilt, and constantly under stress. It was the Lord's final refuge, the architectural equivalent of Plan Z, when every other wall had fallen, when the gates were gone, and the moat was now just a communal swamp. The survivors retreated here to wait for salvation or starvation, whichever came first. The keep wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed for panic. From the outside, a medieval castle looked majestic: towering walls, fluttering banners, the very image of power and permanence. Inside, it was basically a damp refrigerator filled with shouting people and questionable hygiene. Life in a castle wasn't glamorous. It was loud, cold, and perpetually smoky. The same walls that stopped catapults also trapped drafts and cooking fumes. Every room smelled faintly of wet stone, wood smoke, and the lingering despair of everyone who couldn't afford to leave. The grand great hall, where lords feasted and made speeches, was the heart of it all. And by heart, we mean chaotic open concept nightmare. It doubled as dining room, courtroom, party venue, and occasionally battlefield. Dogs wandered freely, tracking mud and worse across the rushes scattered on the floor. Servants tripped over armor. Someone was always yelling about taxes, and someone else was always asleep under a table, probably drunk on weak ale because the water wasn't safe to drink. Heat was a luxury most inhabitants could only dream about. Fireplaces the size of small houses struggle to warm even a few feet of space, while everyone else huddled near the flames, slowly smoking their lungs before winter could finish the job. Windows, those tiny arrow slits we discussed earlier, were brilliant for defense, but useless for light. Candles helped, but only if you enjoyed paying for fire hazards. Most castles remained dim and shadowy even at midday, which meant you navigated by memory and frequently collided with stone corners in the dark. Here's the quirky part. Some castles had interior guardrobes, medieval toilets, that were essentially holes in the wall with a drop straight down the side of the castle. Ingenious for the time, horrifying by any modern standard. some emptied into moats, turning your defensive water feature into a biological weapon. The smell alone could repel armies. Others just dropped waste onto the exterior walls or into pits below, where it accumulated until someone, usually the lowest ranking servant, was ordered to deal with it. Imagine defending a castle during summer, with months of waste baking in the sun beneath your feet. Food was abundant for nobles, but rarely appetizing. Fresh meat was reserved for those at the high table. Everyone else got whatever could be boiled beyond recognition: pottage, salted fish, root vegetables that had seen better months. Bread doubled as plates, which then doubled as compost or animal feed. And if you thought a medieval diet sounded bad, imagine medieval dentistry. There wasn't any. Tooth decay was rampant, infections were common, and the lucky ones simply lost their teeth young and learned to gum their meals. Despite the misery, people were proud to live inside castle walls. To the outside world, the castle symbolized privilege and safety. Inside, it symbolized survival. By stubbornness, you endured the cold, ignored the rats scurrying through the walls, and pretended the dripping ceiling was ambience. Winters were especially brutal. Stone held cold the way it held heat, which is to say barely and inconsistently. Even sleeping chambers, reserved for the lord and his family, offered little comfort. Beds had heavy curtains, not for privacy, but for warmth, creating small fabric tents that trapped body heat. Historians still argue whether castle living was genuinely miserable or simply normal by medieval standards. Some point out that peasant cottages were far worse: drafty, cramped, with dirt floors and thatch roofs that leaked. By comparison, stone walls and multiple floors represented luxury. Others note that even nobles complained constantly in their letters about the cold, the smoke, and the endless maintenance required to keep castles functional. The truth probably lies somewhere between. Castles were uncomfortable by modern standards, but represented the best protection available in an age of constant violence. Yet for all its flaws, the castle was the beating heart of medieval life, a monument to paranoia and endurance. It kept you alive, even if it slowly drove you insane. Living in a fortress meant one thing: you were safe, uncomfortable, and mildly smoky, but at least not dead. That was the medieval bargain, and for most inhabitants, it was enough. But castles weren't just fortresses. They were reminders: massive, immovable, impossible to ignore. Every stone whispered the same message: someone richer than you lives here, and he owns everything you can see. For lords and kings, castles weren't built merely to defend land. They were built to control it. You didn't need to patrol every road when your fortress sat on the horizon like a divine threat. It was the medieval version of surveillance, psychological dominance achieved through architecture alone. Each castle served as the physical embodiment of authority. Peasants plowed beneath it, merchants paid taxes because of it, and the local priest probably blessed it while quietly resenting it. The walls weren't just defenses, they were propaganda. The message was clear: obedience equals safety, rebellion equals suicide. Everything about castle architecture reinforced hierarchy. The lord's chamber sat high above everyone else, partly for defense, mostly for ego. Guests had to climb endless stairs before being granted an audience, ensuring they arrived physically exhausted and emotionally submissive. Even the design of the great hall was psychological. The lord sat elevated at the far end, while peasants and petitioners stood below, lit by smoky torches that made everyone look slightly guilty. The architecture also served a surveillance function. From the battlements, guards could watch every field, every road, and occasionally every questionable decision made by villagers. If someone tried to rebel, the castle saw it first. If someone tried to flee, the castle watched them fail in real time. By the late Middle Ages, castles had done their job a little too well. They'd survived centuries of siege warfare, political upheaval, and the occasional plague that wiped out half the workforce. But then gunpowder arrived, and suddenly all those proud fortresses looked less like strongholds and more like expensive rock collections waiting to be demolished. Cannons made walls feel inadequate, and the nobility did what the nobility always does when practicality dies. They redecorated. The first cannons appeared in Europe during the 14th century, crude and unreliable weapons that were as dangerous to their operators as to their targets. But within 100 years, artillery technology advanced dramatically. By the 15th century, cannons could fire iron balls weighing hundreds of pounds with enough force to shatter stone walls that had stood for generations. What used to take months of siege could now be accomplished in an afternoon with enough gunpowder and optimism. Medieval warfare evolved overnight, and castles, the ultimate defensive invention, went out of style faster than chainmail underwear. The irony was brutal. The stronger the castle, the louder it exploded. Builders had spent centuries perfecting geometry and gravity, and now both betrayed them. Cannonballs turned pride into rubble, towers into confetti, and keeps into smoking echoes of well that escalated quickly. Lords tried to adapt. They lowered walls to reduce target profiles, widened moats, and built earthen ramparts to absorb blasts. But by the 16th century, the writing was on the wall, and the wall was on the ground. Here's the quirky historical twist. Some castle owners actually welcomed the transition. Maintaining a fortress was exhaustingly expensive. Constant repairs, garrisons to feed, walls to patrol. When cannons made traditional defenses obsolete, it gave lords an excuse to abandon military architecture altogether and build something more comfortable. The Renaissance was dawning, and with it came new ideas about power, beauty, and how to spend obscene amounts of money. The once impenetrable castle evolved into something new, part palace, part status symbol, part overcompensating family heirloom. Thick walls no longer needed to repel trebuchets, so architects filled them with luxury, or at least the medieval approximation of it. Curtains appeared. Carpets covered cold stone floors. Windows actually opened, a bold decision that would have made earlier generations of lords physically ill. Defensive towers became bedrooms, moats transformed into ornamental gardens, arrow slits widened into scenic views, allowing occupants to enjoy sunrises without worrying about incoming arrows. Where boiling oil once poured, imported wine now flowed. What was once a fortress became a fashion statement. The new buzzword was comfort. Central fireplaces that actually spread warmth instead of just smoke. Tapestries covered stone walls, partly for insulation, partly to remind guests that their host could afford someone else's embroidery. Kitchens grew bigger, not to feed armies, but to roast peacocks and swans for elaborate dinner parties. The feudal age of fear was slowly being replaced by the Renaissance age of showing off. Of course, some lords couldn't quite let go of tradition. They still built mock battlements and fake arrow slits, not for defense, but for aesthetic intimidation. Nothing says wealth like a decorative murder hole. These castles were less about surviving a siege and more about surviving social judgment. By the 15th century, the castle had officially retired from warfare and joined the world of architecture as historic luxury housing. It became the medieval equivalent of a sports car, unnecessary, flashy, and mostly for impressing people you secretly despised. Historians still argue whether the decline of castles represented progress or loss. Some view it as inevitable evolution, societies becoming more centralized, warfare becoming more professional, rendering private fortifications obsolete. Others see it as the end of an era when individual lords held genuine military power, replaced by bureaucratic states with standing armies. Either way, the transformation was complete. From fortress to palace, from necessity to nostalgia. But there was genius in this evolution. The medieval castle, born from chaos and fear, had reinvented itself as art. No longer a fortress of war, now a fortress of taste. It stood as a monument to humanity's favorite pastime, turning survival into style. And while cannons roared outside, inside the lords were too busy discussing tapestry color schemes to notice their world had fundamentally changed. As castles fell silent across Europe, peasants who had once trembled at their shadows now picnicked in their courtyards. The old fortresses, once roaring with soldiers and smoke, turned into ruins, silent monuments to paranoia and craftsmanship. Some became prisons, others monasteries, and many just crumbled into scenic tourist attractions. The stones that had declared, "You shall not pass," now whispered, "Please pay admission." Yet even in ruin, castles refused to vanish. They lingered like proud ghosts of an age that refused to be forgotten. Because even when you blow them up, you still look up. That's the power of a castle. It never truly falls. It just waits for the next century to admire it. Their legacy isn't just military, it's psychological. They taught Europe how to think in stone, how to project power through architecture, how to turn fear into beauty and call it civilization. Today, they're backdrops for weddings, video games, and drone footage. We romanticize them, pretending the past was noble and the drafty rooms were charming. The truth is simpler. Castles weren't magical, they were necessary. And in their necessity, they became beautiful. They were fear turned into architecture, survival dressed up as art. And in their silence, they remind us that even the strongest walls eventually crumble, but the idea behind them never really dies. And so, as the last torch flickers out in some distant tower, we leave the age of castles behind. Those stone giants still stand in fields across Europe, holding secrets in their shadows, whispering stories to anyone who'll listen. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, maybe you'll dream of spiraling staircases and arrow-slit windows of lords and servants, of walls that held back the world. Remember, castles weren't perfect, but they endured. And perhaps that's what we all hope to do, to build something, however small, that outlasts the storm. Rest well, dreamer. Let history cradle you gently into the night. If you found tonight's journey through medieval stone and smoke soothing, consider subscribing for more historical escapes. Tomorrow's ruins are waiting, and so am I. Until then, sweet dreams, and may your castle always have sturdy walls.